Good evening and welcome to ELOSOFUMARTAKES. This is our 83rd take live from Euless, Texas. I'm your host as always, Barry Duplessis, and I'm so proud, so pleased, and so feeling so technologically advanced at this moment that I really can't stand it. And I'm so excited to welcome in my guest here, and I'll be introducing in just a moment. So I really appreciate everyone tuning in tonight. We're going to have a fantastic show. This is our very first show on Facebook Live. So I want to thank a special nod of thanks to my executive producer for the night, Mr. William Cooper of CigarCoop.com. Man extraordinaire of many talents. And of course, would like to thank some other folks because without this show, without these people, the show would actually not be possible. So definitely want to thank our sponsors for tonight's show, Drew Estate. Drew Estate announced the rebirth of the BOTL, Brothers of the Leaf, as a Drew Diplomat retailer, brick and mortar exclusive. BOTL was displayed at the Drew Estate booth at this past IPCPR convention and trade show, which we'll be talking about a little bit more in depth tonight. Harkening back to the early days of the interweb, a number of cigar communities formed that all shared one common bond, their love of the leaf. One of those early communities was BOTL.org, truly captured the spirit and a passion that we all share for our beloved cigar culture. So Drew Estate brought back the BOTL, a passion project dedicated to every cigar geek around the world. Featured in 3 aficionado sizes, the Corona, Corona Gorda, and Lancero. It is truly catering to a targeted market of core traditional discerning consumers. Each cigar is wrapped in a bold Connecticut broadleaf wrapper, layered in with complexity from an Ecuadorian Connecticut binder, and capped off with the nuance of rich fillers from Nicaragua. So check out your nearest Drew Diplomat retailer for a BOTL. I'm going to give this one a personal nod because I smoked it this week, and it is outstanding. What else also is outstanding is if you're looking at us right now on Facebook Live, again, we really appreciate y'all for tuning in tonight. But if you guys are catching us wherever you listen to podcasts, whether that's Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Podbean, Spotify, TuneIn, or whatever you listen to podcasts, you are listening to us exclusively because of Cornelius and Anthony Premium Cigars. Cornelius and Anthony Premium Cigars is steeped in tobacco tradition. For over 150 years, the Bailey family has been a part of America's tobacco heritage, passionately caring for the land they cultivate in Keysville, Virginia. Cornelius and Anthony's devotion to the finest grown tobacco and foremost aspects of craftsmanship allows them to introduce the most exquisite cigars to the market. They invite you to enjoy their portfolio of premium hand-rolled cigars and experience their dedication to producing an exceptional product. So good evening, everyone. Really appreciate y'all tuning in. Again, I'm so excited and so pleased to be on Facebook Live, and so proud and so pleased to welcome in my first guest as we've ventured into this new technological format, and returning for the second time to ELOSOFUMARTAKES is my wonderful guest tonight, Mr. Nicolas Antonio Jimenez, senior editor of Cigar Snob magazine. Nick, how are we doing tonight?
Doing good, man. How about you?
I'm doing fantastic, man. I'm going to totally give credit to your extensive resume here in just a bit. I didn't want to do that in the intro because I feel like it was already dragging already. So I will give credit where credit is due because your resume is quite extensive and, very, very, very awesome. So, wanted to jump right into it, Nick. Unfortunately, you're not smoking tonight, but you are utilizing your cigars for a very important role at the moment.
I am, yes. I don't smoke in my house. I usually would smoke outside, but it's a little dark, and the only lighting I could figure out sort of made it look like I was telling scary stories by a campfire. So I figured for purposes of this conversation, people can just assume I smoke regularly. But right now, my cigars are being used to prop up the camera so that you're not looking at my double chin from underneath. So I figured just to give you and everybody else a slightly better angle, more on par with what you're doing, I'd use the humidor for that purpose.
There's another reason a lot of people think that like I'm strategically trying to do the opposite of what I do on Cigar Coop's Primetime Special Edition, which is known for a really in-depth, really lengthy, we dive into subjects. I mean, we really dive in, and I'm usually sit back and in a relaxed position. And yes, I wanted to change it up differently, but my shows are obviously shorter because I'm sitting with like perfect posture, and this is quite painful. I don't know how like supermodels and politicians do it, because perfect posture really really sucks. It's
Right,
but
right, right.
like again, Nick, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Your time and your work with Cigar Snob, Cigar Snob magazine notwithstanding, we're gonna get into that here in a little bit. But I wanted to talk about one of your amazing other projects. You of course are the editor and founder of DADE magazine, and you've also launched another podcast, the PanCon podcast, where you guest host with a pretty renowned chef. Am I wrong?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. You mentioned DADE. So DADE is sort of a little side pet project where I do sort of created it as a home for some of the journalism that doesn't really have an obvious home at Cigar Snob, which is obviously my full-time gig. And the idea had never been for it to be like a personal blog, right? I wanted it to be a place for all kinds of stuff. We can, if you really want to, get a little bit deeper into what the purpose and the idea there was. But to that end of not having it all be about me, I was looking for another voice to add there. And I met through another friend for whom I was producing a podcast, Mike Beltran. So Mike is the chef partner at Arc Hospitality, which is the parent company that owns Ariete, which is their flagship restaurant in Coconut Grove, which is the oldest neighborhood in the city of Miami, as well as Chugs, which is a Cuban diner, Time Out Market in Miami Beach, which has locations all over the world.
I'm sorry, Chugs?
Yeah, Chug. So Chug, the story there, he gets the question all the time. Chug was his nickname from when he was a little kid. From what he said, I think it might have been like a high school nickname. Like maybe he walked into class drinking one of those milk chugs that
right. I remember those. I was like,
yeah.
Said that. I was like, this guy's a chef. This that has to be the connection, right? Because I used to love those things.
Yeah, so he jokes, that was that's where the nickname came from, and then into adulthood, he was chugging all sorts of other stuff that helped the nickname stick. And so Time Out Market in Miami Beach, he's got a kiosk there called Leña, which is it's a sort of a wood fire concept. They own a couple of bars, so Taurus, which is an old bar in Coconut Grove, and Scapegoat, which is a newer bar in Miami Beach, and finally Nave, which is the seafood concept that should be opening later in the year. He worked under Norman Van Aken, Michael Schwartz, worked with Hetty Goldsmith, so some big names, not only in South Florida food, but in food, in general. So very exciting for me, that we were able to get him on board and that he was down with the idea of doing a podcast. He, among South Florida chefs, was already known for being pretty outspoken, especially when it comes to the influencer phenomenon, which I'm sure just living in social media, the food influencer thing tends to be a little more shameless and a little more silly than the cigar blogger thing. I feel like the cigar world is sort of the model of what the online independent media community should look like, where it's people at least attempting by and large to do things with some integrity. Maybe it's just that the cigar smoking community doesn't have enough there's not enough room for douchiness, I guess.
I really enjoyed back in the day before influencer even became a known commodity in today's social media. I really enjoyed for lack of a better word, the snobbery of some really good food and restaurant critic blogs, man. I enjoy cooking. It's one of my favorite pastimes and everything. And so it's one of those things where I already thought that was kind of there. And then when the influencer, phenomenon took over, it got worse, and I didn't even think that was possible in the realm and everything. So, so was this was this your partner Michael Beltran's kind of way of kind of not getting back, but being able to stand up for himself a little?
Oh, no. He had been doing a good enough job on his own of that. All I mean by that is that he was already used to the idea of like putting his voice out there in public. So the podcast is not about that. But that's among the things that, other people in the food community locally, had come to associate with him, was just that he's a very outspoken guy. And so it makes it easy, I think, to take, to work with him on a podcast where that's not necessarily his world. But it does sort of come naturally. So, so far we've dealt with things like, for example, my partner, Carlos, has been a friend of mine since the first grade, and we are kind of doing this thing together. The most recent episode was a conversation with Mike about the people behind the business. So, recruiting and developing people, and how he trains people, and how he gets, a team of people behind, a unified message for the company. We've done other ones that where he's interviewing other chefs. So, for example, Pablo Zitzman, who I know in the conversation.
Love that episode. Yeah, please talk about that one.
Yeah. So if I know that when you spoke with Matt Booth, you mentioned that you're a Food Network fan.
Yes.
So Pablo had recently been on, unfortunately it aired just after our interview with him, so it didn't come up in the conversation, but he was on that Beat Bobby Flay thing, and beat Bobby Flay on that show. Awesome. So that was pretty cool. So, it's all kinds of stuff, but all from a chef's, or from this one particular chef's perspective. And I'm sure that over time we'll get into all sorts of other issues that, relate to varying degrees to food. So, for instance, we've been talking about getting his tattoo artist on as a guest, and sort of tackling the issue of creativity from those two different angles. I'm sure, just because I'm involved, we'll get some cigar people involved. So it'll be a lot of fun. It's sort of an outlet for me to kind of get my head out of cigars a little bit, even though we usually smoke when we record.
I was going to say, but you guys have that, you still have that cigar tie-in. So this is a different venture for you, but you're not leaving your identity behind it. You're taking it along for the ride, which is something that what I really like about it. And even though a lot of the stuff this stuff does interest me, that's not fair. But I think for folks that are maybe fans of your work at Cigar Snob, they can still truly appreciate it and really enjoy it, because you're not leaving that piece to the side or behind. You're kind of bringing it along with you. Just to touch on that last episode that you had with by
the way, I want to note that I know Mike is watching.
Yes, I saw his comment. Yes, he said that guy is an a-hole. Yeah.
I don't know if he's talking about me or himself, but I'm going to assume he's talking about me. And that's fine. I'll own that.
Michael, appreciate you tuning in. Thanks so much. I'm gonna talk about you a little bit more here, because I did like this last episode where he talked a little bit about culture and hiring practices and things, because I think that's important. That was important for him to kind of get out there, because I think kitchens specifically have this reputation for being a very toxic work environment, and he has a completely different take on it necessarily. And there was a lot of really, really good points that he had. What was your part of that production, your favorite part about that piece necessarily?
Yeah, I mean, for me, so much of it is new, because I don't come from that world, and because, kind of like cigars, right? People who come into, say, a cigar trade, I'm sure that you've spoken to somebody, let's say at the IPCPR trade show, when it was their first year there. It's kind of, from a professional perspective, kind of a culture shock. It's very much unlike any other sort of workplace or any other sort of trade show. It's very weird for people who are in it for the first time. I think the food and beverage world, and especially the restaurant and bar world, is a little bit the same way. My restaurant experience is limited to my making the coffee at my grandmother's restaurant before it closed when I was like 9 years old. There were very low expectations for me then. But Mike is doing this at a very high level. And so, to your point, right, there is a sort of intensity to the culture of kitchens at that level. He, on multiple occasions, has brought up, and I'm blanking now on whose quote this was, but he talks about the idea of leading as a shepherd rather than as a Viking. Right. And so the image that sort of comes to mind is that, like, Gordon Ramsay yelling at you and throwing shit across the room and all that sort of stuff, as opposed to taking on more of a most of us would consider like the effective leader role, where it maybe does not involve being so Viking-like and chopping heads off. So that to me, I think, was one of the more interesting things. And I think there's also, you mentioned being a as I mentioned that you talked about with Matt Booth, a Food Network fan. And I think one of the other interesting things has been being around people who are in the industry and hearing their take on the impact of that like celebrity chef phenomenon, and like and those celebrity chefs becoming household names, and they're taking on a different role in the culture where now suddenly there's all this sort of like glamour attached to success in a kitchen that maybe didn't exist, or at least not to the same degree 10, 15, 20 years ago. So, but I mean, it's still a relatively new thing. So I'm still picking up all kinds of stuff. It's a new world for me, and what I enjoy is the same thing that I enjoy in my work at Cigar Snob, which is telling stories, and in this case, helping somebody else tell their story, which is really what's exciting to me there. You know, at Cigar Snob. Oh, there we go. So. Joe Beeson Canada quote from his podcast with David Chang, "Be a shepherd, not a Viking." That's Mike chiming in. So I'm keeping an eye on the comments here.
Yeah, me too.
So yeah, that's been the exciting thing for me. There is playing a role in other people getting their voice out there, and that's also been the challenge is finding a way to keep the content regular without it feeling like it's the Nick Jimenez show. And so having a whole podcast that is, that centers on his perspective, whether that's our getting things out of Mike or Mike as the interviewer, where I get to just sort of like hang back and just kind of let it happen and maybe, guide production a bit is cool.
Yeah, it's great to have a partner that has a completely different perspective than you to do a different, project that's not necessarily centered around your day to day. But your day to day, as a senior editor at Cigar Snob magazine, as we talked about, what I really appreciate about your work is, I still have a really huge fondness for the written word, and online media certainly is written word as well. But the thing that I love, I'm still very much in love with the way a magazine comes together, but as far as your day to day with the magazine and everything, what's kind of been the most challenging thing for you from a production standpoint, as more and more so, and you guys are contributing in this way, obviously, by doing a lot more things digitally. The podcast, which we'll talk about here in a second, for example, is just one of the many outlets, and of course, you do have a great website as well. But as the world streams to the more digital outlet, what are some of the biggest challenges that you've come face to face with, and because I think you guys have handled it pretty well, and I just want to get your opinion on it.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're still kind of figuring out what digital looks like for us. The podcast is one thing where we sort of settled on, that as a thing that works and that will not be going anywhere. The bigger question for us is, what does how do we manage the online and digital release of the content that goes into the print magazine? And what I mean by that is usually we'll try to maybe hold off on sharing things digitally for a couple of months, just so that we're not cannibalizing newsstand sales, because that affects us on the sales side, and it also affects the print advertiser, right? The advertiser wants to know that people are picking up the magazine. Well, okay, why would you do that if then people are going to go online and not bother with the magazine you just paid for an ad for? And so there are a lot of business considerations there, but then it also affects the editorial side, because if you know that you want it to feel fresh or at least not feel stale when you go and release something 2 months later, because again, we publish every other month, what does that mean for what you're publishing in print?
Correct.
It hasn't had a huge impact on us because we always try to do evergreen content. And so, for instance, in this most recent issue, the Q&A that we did with Ed Reed is going to be just as interesting, we hope, a month from now, 2 months from now, 6 months from now, as it was the day that we printed it and first shipped it. I think that's sort of a rambly way to answer the question, but I think the shorter way is it doesn't affect a whole lot of what we're doing in terms of changing our core product. It's more about what are we adding. And so we're adding the podcast. we're going to be hopefully very soon launching a whole overhauled website, and that'll have some new stuff on it. It'll include a lot more of the content that we do in print, as well as maybe a little bit more cigar news. Although we don't have, frankly, we don't have the bandwidth to compete on like the really timely stuff with with guys like you and other people who are more on top of the industry and product release news. That's not really our wheelhouse. It's not our bread and butter. And then we're not trying to get into that space.
And that's also my point too, is that like, I don't think people really truly appreciate, it's not like Cigar Snob, has this Newsweek, level staff that's, is, you guys can produce can regularly contribute to the 24-hour news cycle. It's not even clear necessarily that the cigar industry can necessarily, it's pretty darn close. There's a lot of news, and it's darn near 24 hours in some cases, but I think people need to really truly appreciate what you and Eric have done at Cigar Snob and the publication that you guys put out with the small but very strategic and very talented team that you guys have.
Yeah, and just number one, because it's warranted, and number two, because I know if I let you just say me and Eric, I'm gonna hear a lot of shit about it when I get into the office tomorrow. I'm actually the newest person on this team.
Right.
So there's Eric, who owns it with his dad, and they've been at it since 2006. Ivan does an incredible job. Ivan Ocampo does an incredible job with all of the...
He co-hosts on the podcast too, occasionally as well.
Yeah. So he's in there. He's at least with our sort of like editors roundtable sort of episodes. And then if you heard the Ed Reed interview, he does a lot of chiming in with some like really intense Miami Homer talk. Yamilet, Eric's sister, who has been with the magazine full-time since a few years ago, but really has been a member of the team since well before I even moved back down to Miami to join the magazine full-time. And then Andy Astencio, who's our art director, who joined the magazine just before I did, almost immediately after he got here from Cuba. And so he's responsible for all of the page layout and design stuff, and most of the photography that isn't of women, of the models. Almost all the rest of the photography is Andy. So yeah, but we are a very small team, and it's pretty cool that we put out the product we do with that few people.
Now, you mentioned the models, which of course is the showcase, and it's the reason most people, even non-cigar smokers, will pick up Cigar Snob magazine just on site and everything. And you mentioned that Andy doesn't necessarily do that particular layout. Do you guys bring in guest photographers as well as guest models for those pieces, or is there a rotation of photographers? How does that work?
Yeah, so for the last several years, I think we've been using one photographer almost exclusively for those pictorials. His name is David, and he is one of in those circles, he's one of the better known fashion photographers. And I think the product was great, in terms of the production quality before he came along, or before we started working with him regularly. But once we started working with him regularly or almost exclusively, it changed things all the way around, because he has such a reputation with the agencies that we do the casting, that we cast the models from, that these agencies sort of, began to really allow Ivan and Eric, because I have very little to do with that process, to have, almost their pick of the best models. And, I think looking at it from the outside, that sounds like I'm just saying like, oh, they got the hottest chicks. Like it really is. You don't have an appreciation of how small a percentage of models, male and female, can actually pull this off until you're at one of these shoots. Because, just think of how many pictures you've, had taken of yourself where you were trying to look cool and you end up looking like an asshole. And so these people are, it makes a difference if you know how to be photographed. I don't even know that I can articulate what that talent is or how that functions, but there is a difference between somebody who knows what she's doing or what he's doing and somebody who doesn't. And so the best talent, and so I use that word advisedly, has been way more available to us ever since we started working with this one guy who's credited in all these magazines. I'm not going to bother trying to guess what year it was, but I'm sure if you start flipping through all those pictorials, the last page always has the credits for the stylist and the photographer and all that, and it's going to be his name for the last several years.
It is a truly fabulous team, and definitely thank you for getting everybody's out there so that everyone can really appreciate all these folks that contribute in a lot of ways. Because in a lot of ways, Eric obviously is obviously, and as the co-owner and co-founder, is the most visible member of the team and everything. I've had the privilege of getting to know you over some time as well, and so I haven't had I haven't been able to meet the other folks that are a part of that invaluable team. So absolutely thank you for spotlighting them as well, because they, again, I have tremendous amount of respect for the publication. I think you guys do a phenomenal job and bring a completely, as is the name of my show, a completely different take to the cigar industry while still showing it an amazing amount of respect and still featuring it in such a very unique way that really brings a lot of great content to our audience, our collective audience.
No, man, that's awesome to hear, especially from somebody like you that you consume so much cigar media. To know that it's resonating there, especially in the sea of things that I'm sure you're consuming, is cool.
Absolutely. So we've kind of flirted with it a little bit so far, and we're on one right now in the format of a podcast. Now, this coming November, you will actually celebrate 2 years of the Cigar Snob podcast that you guys have put together. I've been going back. I didn't even realize we talked about this a little bit before the show, and I said, it's about a year old, right? And you're like, well, it's a little bit older. And I went back really quick, and yeah, sure enough, you guys are coming up on 2 years, and you guys have interviewed some fantastic people, including, I asked you, what were a couple of your favorites? It's always hard to pick, that one favorite episode and everything, but one that you mentioned is still kind of the unicorn that I'm seeking. Which is Carlito Fuente. You had the honor and the privilege of sitting down with that. So since he's one of my unicorns, I'd like to know what it's like to sit down with that gentleman and talk a little shop about the great all cigar industry.
Dude, one of the ways that I've been lucky to be a part of the Cigar Snob team is that it sort of has meant an automatic level of trust from Carlito. Carlito is somebody who I think, not that he's distrusting, but you can imagine that being a Carlito Fuente, everybody wants a piece of you all the time. And so you've got to be a little, discerning for your own sanity about where you put that time. And
there's only 24 hours in a day. So
exactly, right. I think he's one of those people who just, maybe comes off as like standoffish or elusive because he has to be. But once you're sort of like in that circle of people that he's comfortable and friendly with, the fun thing about that podcast is that once you're in there, and this is not a knock on him at all, it was great. He will not shut the hell up. And so if you listen to that podcast, that was one of our longer ones. I think it goes for close to 2 hours. I think maybe I asked 3 things.
Oh, that's
the rest of it is just the rest of it is just him going, and the rest of it is him just going and going and going. Which was great, and this was right around the time that they had announced plans to open a factory in Esteli.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so, it also came at a great time for the podcast, which was very, very early on, because it gave us a bit of a boost, because we had close to 2 hours, if I'm not mistaken, with the guy who was at the center of the story that everybody and their mother was talking about. And so, anyway, aside from that, just more broadly, and it's also worth mentioning that part of the reason for that relationship still being, as close as it is that Eric, our publisher, Eric Calvino, was the guy who sort of introduced Manny Iriarte to the cigar industry, or at least was part of that very beginning story. So Manny, if I remember the story correctly, and apologies to Manny and everybody else involved if I'm fudging the details here, but Manny was a personal trainer, and he was training, I think, Angel Elizalde, who works at ASP. And so he had also been doing like some photography on the side. And so Angel introduces him to Eric. And so that was how, he ends up sort of picking up all these cigar industry clients. He did some work for EPC. He did some, all kinds of people, until finally he sort of landed and built a great relationship with the Fuentes. And so he's done all sorts of projects for them that we don't have to rehash here, but including the FC DuPont stuff, the Hublot stuff, all sorts of other design projects. And has been involved in all sorts of things that aren't even design related, just because of the level of confidence they have. All of which is to say, there's this like little group, that has a very tight relationship. Manny drops by our office regularly just for coffee and booze, as does a lot of the rest of Miami's cigar community, because they know we have free coffee and booze. And because we're there.
Good to know whenever I'm in town.
Oh no, seriously, yeah. If you're ever in Miami and the door's open, just walk in and start drinking. But yeah, and and it's not just Fuente. I think it's one example of the advantage of not only being in Miami, but also of being a publication where we have the I'd even call it an unfair competitive advantage of being an office full of Cubans, because the connection is immediate, and because we literally speak the language of so many people who don't speak English in the industry, and so we're not working through translators, and we're relating to people in their terms, and we grew up the same way. It makes as fun as the industry is to be a part of and around, it makes it that much more fun to be in Miami and to share that much more outside of cigars with these guys.
I always remember the time that we spent together down in the Dominican Republic last year when we were guests of the Davidoff, the great folks over at Davidoff, and you had asked me about how my interview went with, of course, the legendary Henke Kellner and Eladio Diaz, respectively. And I was talking about how it was really fantastic because we had the opportunity to have Klaus as a translator, and it was a very unique experience for me. And I was like, blah, blah. And I said, don't worry. And this is very sheepishly. I was like, oh, don't worry, man. You're going to be great because Klaus is fantastic. He'll translate for you. It'll be great. And you were so gracious in your response to me. You could have been a huge jerk or somewhere in between, but you were such a gracious gentleman when you continued your dialogue with me for a while, and you were saying translating shouldn't be an issue because Eric and I are very, and you like almost like dropped an octave or native speakers, so it won't be an issue. And I had no idea, obviously.
Right.
Very, very, very embarrassed, but you didn't make me feel bad at all, which was the
moment. No, it's nothing to feel bad about. It's just, I just happened to have spoken it at home when I was a kid. So
and I mean, for that part of it, Nick, being able to talk with these folks who have done a tremendous job, many of them have done a tremendous job of learning English and communicating their stories to us who do not speak their native language. You obviously see a different side of these folks, right?
Sure. Yeah. Oh, for sure. Yeah, and again, it's not even just a language thing, right? It's also just there's an immediate sort of cultural connection there. But yeah, I mean, I think of, for example, AJ Fernandez, who sort of observing him, being around him at the trade show. I think a lot of people see him as maybe on the quieter side for the cigar industry, at least by those standards. And dude, when we're in Nicaragua with AJ Fernandez, he's another guy who, again, because he's comfortable and because he knows he can express himself comfortably without having to strain, it's a totally different personality, and we've, I've had the opportunity to be with Eric and to be at AJ's house, eating at his table in his dining room, just the three of us with like this absurd buffet of Cuban food. And even that, right? Even just the fact that a guy like him or like Eduardo Fernandez knows, or any of these people know that when you're with them in Nicaragua and they're eating their comfort food, it's your comfort food too. Even just, kind of going back to the food thing, right? So there's that connection. And then it's also the language thing that we can just get in AJ's truck and kind of wander aimlessly through his field and know. And when he's thinking out loud, it doesn't feel like he's just talking to himself. We're there and we get it and we're conversing with him. And
right.
So yeah, I mean, it makes a huge difference, and especially with these cigar guys who, you've been around it long enough to know that, especially the people who are really in factories and in the fields all the time, it's not an act. That's all they think about, and that's all they want to talk about. Which for somebody like me, like I'm more of a storyteller, I'm more of a journalist. I'm almost, like with this DADE thing, sometimes I'm looking for a break from cigars. I could, most of us could use it every now and again. These guys have no interest in taking a break from cigars. And so it's cool because if you're just around them, you know that you're going to get a deep into their heads on that issue.
Yeah, I'm very hesitant. I've been practicing and learning a little bit, trying to learn more Spanish because I want to experience that. What's so natural for folks like you and Eric. I would love to have a conversation with AJ Fernandez, for example, or other. We'll go on for hours talking about who, but to be able to speak with them in an environment where they're a little bit more comfortable, I'd know that I would have a much more dynamic conversation. So it's something that I've been working on. I hesitate to say that because word's going to get out, and then they're going to start talking Spanish to me, and it's going to be friggin' terrible. Because
that's the way you learn, right? You got to sort of immerse yourself. There's that's the deal about it. But no, and it's like anything else, right? Like I'm sure there have been other people in the industry that you connect with. Just like I know I'm not a veteran, but I know that the veterans in the industry have that kind of instant connection, right? Because they have that in common. And all that stuff. Just like, so for example, I kind of refer to the story often about kind of like Carlito Fuente. The Padrones are another family who or notoriously don't have a lot of use for interviews. And it's not their favorite thing to do, and I can't blame them. Why the hell would they? They have next to zero need for it. But we were doing an interview.
They don't have a need for reps. Why would they have a need for an interview?
Exactly, right. So so we were doing an interview with George back when they released Damaso. Because that was very new for them, and so they wanted to get the word out, and they were making more of an effort than normal. And the tone of the whole thing changed dramatically when I dropped a mention of the fact that George and I had gone to the same all-boys Jesuit prep school. Obviously graduated different years, but we're alumni of the same mafia-like and so immediately it was like, oh, okay, now we have this thing, and now like we're cool. And the same thing actually with the Garcias. So, they're again perfectly friendly people. But the minute that it came out that I'd graduated from that school, that things got grandkids at this school at Belen, and even Pete Johnson has become like really into the whole thing. So now that's what we talk about every time we see each other. And so it's that, right? I mean, it's or you find out that you're both Dodgers fans, or that, that you grew up in this, or that you lived for a while in the same town in Wisconsin, or whatever it may be.
Right.
Which was, one of the ways that I connected with Rainier Lorenzo at HBC. We both.
I was going to say, I knew there was a connection there, right?
Yeah. We lived in Matt. We both, and I think maybe we even were there at the same time without realizing it, which is odd because it's like all 15 Cubans in Madison, Wisconsin. Somehow we missed each other. So yeah, man, I think it's not just an industry, but a culture that's all about relationships and human connection. And the more of that you have, whether it's based in language or what food you're eating or whatever, the easier this job of getting stuff out of people becomes.
Right. Well, Nick, I want to kind of segue into the meat and potatoes of why I wanted to get you on specifically. As a member of Cigar Media, and again, as we illustrated in the first part of this interview, print publication, I think you have a different perspective than a lot of the folks that I'm surround myself with in the online media sector of it. But whether you're online media, publication media, or just a member of this industry, wherever your particular perspective comes from, no doubt that there is a strong opinion one way or another, because there were a couple of things that happened at this previous trade show just a few weeks ago that kind of rattled the cages, to put lightly. the industry itself. So let's tackle the mild one at first. So IPCPR now has changed its name. They are no longer known as as IPCPR or the International Pipe and Cigar Retailers Association. They are now PCA, Premium Cigar Association. So Nick, the one thing I really, before I want to kind of tackle your thoughts on just the name in general, one thing that I was really surprised about was how they wanted to forego the names of pipes and retailers being in this particular association's name, considering it is a retailer association, and they do have other areas of interest and influence other than premium cigars. What was your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's let me lay a foundation here by saying that whatever opinion stuff I'm expressing here is just mine.
This is Nick Jimenez.
This is
Nick Jimenez talking. Yes,
happens to be a cigar snob, but I don't know. Although I suspect that we all see things roughly the same way. Yeah, I mean, I don't know how much to make of the change in the name. Not only because I don't have a view into the why of those decisions, but also because the decisions made by the organization, regardless of the name, are sort of like perennially confusing to me. I don't quite get a lot of things about the trade show, and a lot of things about the changes that are made year over year. As far as the name, I mean, I don't know. I guess the National Rifle Association also has an interest in handguns, so you could argue that it's just a simplification of the name, and
that's fair.
But then again, you could have simplified the name and called it the Pipe and Cigar Association instead of the Premium Cigar Association, and you could have stuck with the same letters and everything. So I don't know. Then again, we're also cigar people at Cigar Snob magazine. We don't really deal with pipe stuff, so it wasn't an issue that we gave a ton of thought to. But certainly, it did. The fact that they dropped pipe, that they dropped a retailer from the name. I get the sense that it was all just in the interest of streamlining the thing and simplifying the brand of it, maybe making it feel more relatable to consumers, especially as they bring in this consumer day. Like you might feel a little weird as a consumer buying a ticket to a thing that has retail in the name. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know how much to make of it, but that is in and of itself, I think, at least an interesting question to explore, because you do want to see the industry thrive. You want to see it succeed. You want to see it move forward in an obviously positive way. And if the positives aren't immediately obvious, that seems to me like it's cause for concern. Like that it's even that these major moves are being made and that not everybody's, like, okay, yeah, this is the right move. Yeah.
No, and I'm with you to a certain extent. And like, just before we go forward into the really heavy subject here in a second, and just before we talk about the name just a little bit more, I think one of the things that's kind of been kind of misrepresented is because I have very strong opinions on the subject, at least particularly the one we're about to talk about. But I think people misunderstand me that I do not want these changes to be a success. I am a huge supporter of this industry. I am a member of this industry because I choose to be, and I am a proud member of it. And I want this industry to flourish. I do not want it to fail in any regard. And so my criticism, my questions, my critiques, my opinions of some of the changes by the leading organization that it represents this industry as a whole is simply an effort to see how I can be a contributing member to that and move the industry forward, and to make sure and to keep them accountable to make sure that they're doing the things that are in the best interest of the industry. That seems very dogmatic and almost prophetic for me to sit here in a garage in Euless, Texas, to say that I want to hold the executive team of PCA accountable. But I think all of us in the industry, whether you're a member of the organization or not, needs to hold its leadership accountable, or else, things like this things like this happen, and we've got a bunch of people in the industry all kind of shrugging their shoulders like, where did this come from and why did this happen?
Yeah. I mean, I'm not going to name any names about who was giving this kind of feedback, but there were manufacturers and brand owners who I spoke with whose take on it by the end of the show was, I'm not really worried about these changes because they're such bad ideas that there's no way we actually get to 12 months from now with that plan in the form that it's in right now. Whether that's true or not, but I did hear that from enough people that I was like, I don't know, man. I don't know how, I don't know if this is the right path.
Yeah, a strong consensus and majority of people that I spoke to, both retailers, manufacturers, and brand owners, collectively was a majority was along the lines of indifference to dismissal to outright disgust and hatred for the changes. There were a very few loud positive ones that I took great great pride in. My conversation with Pete Johnson, you mentioned him just a moment ago, was don't mean to be obnoxious about it, but he was very inspiring. The few moments that I spent with him on the subject where he was very inspiring, and I took that conversation with me throughout the rest of the week, knowing that someone of his stature and influence was leading towards very positive and supporting the industry. And he might have questions too. He may have doubts as well, but he was very firm on the fact that he was going to stand on the wall with these other folks that stood up there and declared these changes. And he said over and over again to me in that conversation, Bear, I support the industry. I'm going to support the industry, and I'm going to do whatever I can to make sure that it succeeds. And I thought that was wonderfully positive considering who I was speaking to, which was great. To that end, last thought on PCA before we jump into the big thing here. PCA, did the name have to change from MyPCPR to PCA? Your opinion? Nick Jimenez, not senior editor of Cigar Snob, just Nick Jimenez, the person.
I think if the organization is taking the direction of involving consumers heavily, then you've got to change the name at least to remove retailer from the name, because there's no other product I consume where it would be immediately obvious to me that a brand that identifies itself as being a retailer's association is inviting me in. So if that's part of the long-term strategy for PCA, then yeah, it had to change its name. That makes perfect sense to me. The name change to me is the least of it. I think there are, and we could do multiple hours on this. I think that the bigger issue is just whether and how the organization is representing the interests of retailers broadly, right? Including the smaller mom and pop retailers, all the way up to online retailers, and whether that's even, whether the show itself is still a useful model, whether in its current form or in general. I think that and to their credit, they recognize a change has to be made. Whether this is the right change is an open question. But the show, as it has existed for the 6 or so years that I've been at Cigar Snob magazine, feels to me like it has outlived its usefulness.
And that seems to be a really strong opinion from my colleague on Cigar Coop Primetime Special Edition. Is Will Cooper has very similar feelings about, and questions at least, about the usefulness of the trade show in general. And it in the world that we lived in, we talked about print publication and your focus as it's kind of shifting to the mold of digital media, et cetera. We live in a different time, and there was a time where trade shows were a necessity for large organizations and everything, and there are a lot of reasons for retailers not to attend the show, expense being at the very top of it, yes, but there are other factors as well that kind of contribute to it. So now they've ushered in this new name, which overall, I'm pleased with the simplification of the name, much needed in my opinion. I'm a fan of the new logo. I think it's simplistic and it has a good story behind it. I'm a sucker for a good story, but I think it could have been polished up a little bit if I'm really being heavily critical. But the big thing that I've been critical about was the way that they it was leaked out in the way that it was announced, and particularly with the second subject, which is, of course, of Cigar Con. So now consumers are going to be welcomed into the trade show on day one, as the current model is dictating. So we're gonna bring consumers in, and this right off the bat, one of the things that Director Pierce, Scott Pierce, director of now PCA, said in his announcement at the trade show was that this is not going to be a trick-or-treat event, and but they will have access to the show floor basically one day earlier than media, and to the retailer, which, again, being the retailer organization, definitely kind of stirred the pot a little bit. And this has been something that's been kind of rumored and talked about for years and everything. And so finally it's kind of come to fruition, at least in announced form. Has yet to happen, of course. We're still waiting for next year to happen. But what was one of your initial thoughts in terms of the way that it was announced and your feelings on it just in general, before any explanation, before the press conference afterwards, and before hearing opinions from people in the industry?
Yeah, so I guess that's a little tough to sort of think of the order in which I heard what I heard when and from whom, because there were some people who, we were sort of getting hints of all this from in private, off the record, whatever, well before any of the teasers or spoilers or whatever you want to call it. So I guess one way to answer the question would just be like, okay, before the show itself, what I knew about it at that point, and before any of the explainers that were given at the trade show press conferences or seminars or whatever else. Cigar Snob back in November did an event that we called the Lechon Challenge. And it was kind of our way of doing a blowout event that we intend to do annually, that we felt more closely reflected not only who the cigar industry is, but also what cigar smokers want out of an event. I don't see how you do, because what is it? The show floor is supposed to be open for like 5 or 6 hours to 4,000 some odd people.
Yeah, that's the goal. 4,500 consumers.
Yeah. If you're a cigar smoker, the reason you're drawn to cigars is the experience of smoking the cigar. And the reason you're drawn to cigar events is the experience of smoking it around other people. I don't see how you have 4,000 some odd people participate in an event that only lasts a few hours in the middle of the day when nobody's really like in party mode, that is anything other than a trick-or-treat event. I could be wrong. I have no idea what that event's going to look like. I hope I'm wrong. I hope that it's not just a lot of people lining up so that retailers can give them an elevator pitch, and the whole thing. But so that aspect of it, the aspect of the experience of the event itself, if I had to bet, if I were a betting person, I would bet that it is not the sort of thing that really draws people to the cigar culture and to the experience of smoking around other smokers. It just seems very difficult to pull off. I haven't heard from very many cigar brands or cigar manufacturers that they're particularly excited about the format. Certainly everybody loves the idea of getting in front of consumers, but there are a lot of ways to do that. And, whether this is the optimal way is an open question. I don't really see why an organization like PCA needs to do it in the same event. I think there are other ways to gather the intelligence that they want to gather from this. And so that brings me to the third point, which is, I think, the first thing that I thought, and this does tie back to your original question of like, what was I thinking immediately when I first heard all this news? The first thing that I thought was, I really hope that if they're opening it up to consumers, for an organization whose purpose is supposed to be to represent the retailers, that there's a mechanism in place to feed retailers some kind of intelligence about what is exciting consumers. So that aspect of it, that is good. I think that's a good thing for the industry. I think the industry does too little of that sort of thing. It's all very like seat of our pants, let's just kind of do all this anecdotal stuff. And it's a combination of like, what I like and whatever. I just don't know that there's a very good reason for not giving yourself more time to process data and to analyze data and to really pull useful stuff and present it in a way that serves as more of a guide. Right now, I think if the idea is that on day one, all these consumers are engaging with these brands, and on day two, the retailers are supposed to take that intelligence and apply it to their buying the next day, I don't know how many people are going to be able to turn those decisions around and really make informed decisions on what will be 4,000 people worth of data. That's a lot. That's a lot to process.
Logistics is a huge concern. Absolutely.
Not just the logistics though. Like let's suppose that every time you're handed a cigar, let's suppose that somehow you're able to squeeze all this into all that time, and you actually do smoke every cigar you're given and fill out some kind of a survey or a flavor sheet or something on that cigar. Let's just imagine in this fantasy world. Mm-hmm. There's no way to process all that data by the next day in time for the retailers to say, okay, this is what we learned 24 hours ago, and we're going to use all this to inform our buying decisions over the course of the next 72 hours. I don't know how that happens. Maybe I'm just not smart enough. But I've been a part of other industries where, people were much more accustomed to using data than they are in cigars. And that is a tall task. So I hope I'm wrong about all of that. And I'm not suggesting that the goals are misguided. I just think if I were the dictator of the cigar industry, I would probably do a consumer event 6 months away or a month away, just to have some comfort in knowing like, okay, we've got time to analyze this data to really make sense of what we saw from consumers, and then present the retailers who we're supposed to be representing and in whose interests we're supposed to be working with something really, truly useful that can guide their buying decisions. Because you're making big investments and it's just 24 hours later.
Yeah, there's a lot of questions, and one of the main questions that came up in the post announcement press conference were centered around cost. It took up a little bit more focus than I probably was interested in it, but in terms of the amount of time that we were given. But cost is a huge concern, and what I did appreciate was that they were very candid in the fact that they didn't know at the time. They probably still don't. It's only been a few weeks, and they probably have a little bit more of a clear picture as they're working over the next few months to bring this to fruition by next year's trade show. And so cost is a huge thing as well. And my concern about cost is, yes, you have to invest in your future, or else you have no future. I'm not that naive, and while I'm not an economics professor, I do understand the concept of buying futures and investing in your future. And the way to do that is to invest in the people that are ultimately driving your product. And there was a lot of preaching on education, which I was a huge fan of hearing that as well. But cost was a huge discussion point. And my question is, if the costs are anything near kind of rough estimates, they've kind of been shot off and what they're kind of talking about in the grand scheme. My concern about the cost that they're spending on this particular type of event, of course, not knowing yet if it's going to be successful, and you don't know if something's going to be successful until you do it, completely understood.
Right.
But the amount of costs that they're going to be putting forth for this specific event, meanwhile, our industry is in peril legislatively and with regulations from the FDA, and we're fighting that battle too. That's money that's being taken away from that fight. And so that's at least a huge concern for me.
Yeah, I mean, that's a big issue. There's so much that I don't understand about how and why uh, that FDA issue is tackled the way it's tackled. Not just by PCA, but by CRA and by local and regional organizations that have some of the same goals. I think I think that there's a lot of work to be done. I think at the end of the day, that seems to me like it seems to me like it's more important. The word you use, imperiled, is exactly right. There are a lot of businesses that are absolutely imperiled. And it's not just with federal regulation or federal legislation. It's the local and state level stuff.
Absolutely.
I was not too long ago. I don't know if you ever smoked in Seattle, but if you are, you're part of a very small club because it's very difficult to smoke in Seattle. So and that's got nothing to do or very little to do with the FDA. And this is same deal with Boston. And what I see over all these years of traveling at least every other month, if not more often, to visit tobacconists and talk to people at shops, and I'm sure that you see a lot of this where you've worked and where at other places that you visit, is that too few people are engaged in this issue. And it's not that too few people understand it, because I think that there are enough people with like a baseline understanding of what's happening, even if that's just as simple as, yeah, the FDA wants to regulate cigars.
Okay,
And
baseline understanding, I'll agree with you. I was going to say
baseline understanding, right? The minutia of it, but I don't think that you need people to understand the minutia of it for them to do something about it. And so the question becomes, if we're not getting far enough with, here's a form letter to write your congressperson, what else can we be doing? And what can we be doing? What can the industry be doing to make sure that it's not just like two people in a major metro area who show up to city council meetings when there's like major new rule changes on the books and they need somebody to testify or whatever. So I think engagement is the bigger problem, and I think that that's a much more important goal probably than making sure that 4,000 smokers are there to smoke all the new product the day before the tobacconists are ready to buy it and put it on the shelves.
100%. I completely agree. Engagement
and by the way, and I'm sorry to cut you off. Sure. And that's not to say that that's not a goal of the PCA. I know that they do have people there who are working on that. I just think, again, the show itself, maybe that's a better way to frame what I'm saying. I think that to the cigar industry broadly, not just PCA, and I'm talking about even some of the biggest, most successful, some of my favorite cigar makers, like outside of the making the cigar and the things that are just our bread and butter, there's not a lot of outside of the box thinking, because it's such a traditional product and it's such a traditional world. And it makes perfect sense. Outside of like the Rocky Patels of the world who came from the law, why would any of us, myself included, I'm not a lobbyist, why would any of us know what the hell we're doing when we're tackling this issue? But I think that, there's got to be a real willingness to challenge the way that we think about the things that we've been used to spending our time on. And like you and I think both, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think you kind of agreed with me, or at least maybe you said that Will agrees, that this trade show has maybe outlived its usefulness. Mm-hmm. That doesn't mean the PCA has outlived its usefulness. The
Correct,
PCA is absolutely necessary. You need that in the world. Maybe its purpose evolves beyond a trade show as like the principal thing.
Yeah, a leaderless movement is absolutely futile. So I completely agree with that. The PCA has not, in no way, form, of fashion, regardless of my opinions on the trade show, your opinions on the trade show, or anyone else's opinion on the trade show specifically, the organization has definitely not outlived its usefulness, because it's emphatic for us to have. That's the incorrect word. It's incredibly important for us to have a a strong leadership in order to present our issues to the people that make these decisions, because that's where kind of where I'm lost is I'm wondering how the dots get connected. And you brought up a really great point, Nick, because you were talking about how does a smoking event translate to a more engaged, more mobilized consumer.
Yeah.
It's not just again, I'm a big proponent of education because I think education will lead to engagement. Engagement can lead to mobilization. And it's kind of the lack, and the devil's in the details always. It's the kind of the lacking of the details in between those very broad stroke points that I'm kind of like, where I'm most frustrated with the kind of decisions for it. Again, I want this event to be a success because ultimately that dot will connect to the next dot will connect to the next dot, and so on. So it's just a point that's been brought up over the past few weeks since the announcement and the trade show, and will be for the next 11 months until Cigar Con actually does come to fruition, that a lot of us are going to continue to have.
Yeah, so I know, and I'm looking here in the comments, you got Frank Cannon saying, so the word is PCA wants to do this to contribute to legislation costs, which makes sense. There are multiple large festivals to partner with and make this happen. Get 100%. With the big and small shows to contribute.
What I've been saying.
I agree. I think that there is absolutely a need to do these events to raise money and to get creative about raising money toward these legislative efforts. My point is that if the idea is to raise money by doing these events, the event is its own product. And I think that those of us who are in the cigar world, because we're in this scene, so to speak, so deep, we sort of lose sight of the fact of how many more casual smokers there are. Let me give you an example. So I was at Pro Cigar a couple of years ago. And I was at El Grito de Carlito, which is the Chateau Fuente, that gazebo that you've seen a million times in a bunch of photos. That was the first year they gave a tour, and they weren't giving a tour of the factory or the farms. They were giving a tour of the Cigar Family Charitable Foundation facilities. So I'm sitting next to this guy who had just sort of gone to this thing on a whim. I think he saw a mention of it in the Cigar magazine, or a buddy mentioned the event to him, and he had nowhere else to be, so he bought himself a ticket and he went to the DR and he was doing this thing. Very casual smoker, didn't know anything. So we're sitting there, and Carlito Fuente is giving this whole thing, is giving a spiel about the foundation, and he's getting all emotional, and as Carlito Fuente does, like he cares so much about this, and he's his eyes are welling up, and he's very passionate about what the foundation is doing. And of course, he's talking about his cigars and his family heritage and this, that, and the other thing. And this guy who's sitting next to me leans over to me and he says, wow, this guy feels really strongly about all this stuff. Who is he? No idea who Carlito Fuente was. That's the guy that you have to reach. And You're not going to reach him by saying, would you like to go to a convention center and spend 6 hours in lines so that you can get cigars from sales reps? That's not fun. To the average dude who doesn't spend time with these people, that's not a fun thing to do. You know what's fun? What's fun, as an example, there are a million fun things in the world.
Right.
What we did when we did our event back in November, and what we'll continue to do, or at least some version of this, was you get to the event, here's your 15 cigars. We got the equivalent of a coat check for your cigars. And from here on out, everybody else is just at a party. And you know what the 5 cigar guys, the 5 cigar manufacturers who are the primary sponsors are doing? They're not handing you cigars. They're cooking you a pig. That's friggin' cool.
Yeah. That's
cool. And what you want to do is raise money, it can't just be, hey, how many people can we get to stand in line for cigars? It's, how cool can we make this for even the person who doesn't give a damn about the cigar? If the objective is to raise money, if the objective is to give away cigars to geeks like you and me, then sure, have people stand in line.
Yeah.
But that's not the goal, and that's not how you reach that critical mass where you have a comfortable, a cushion of money to put toward that fight. If funding that fight is the important thing, then it can't be about the geeks.
No, 100%. Like, the geeks aren't the problem because, we're the ones that are engaged into at least in a certain level and are more informed.
And there aren't enough of us to pay for it.
Exactly, 100%. The common smoker, the casual smoker, or even the guy who's buying online at discounted prices for these cigars that he's smoked his entire life. His dad smoked his entire life, and his grandfather smoked his entire life. The Cohiba, the Romeo and Julieta, the Monte Cristo fans. Those are the guys and gals that make up the that make this industry so popular and make it move, at least financially speaking. How do you reach those folks, and how do you get them to be excited about the next project that Nick Melillo or Steve Saka is? Steve and Nick are not lacking in fans, and they're certainly not lacking in notoriety for all that they've accomplished in this industry. But as a whole, as a general rule, and even you just pointed out the fact, arguably this industry's most famous individual, top three, and a guy who's at Pro Cigar doesn't know who he is. That's the individual that we need to reach. And that's the problem.
Yeah, we're coming at this too often from the perspective of people who go to a trade show where it's easier for Carlito Fuente, or where it's easier for Ed Reed to walk around the trade show without being recognized or asked for an autograph than it is for Carlito Fuente.
Mm-hmm.
You leave that trade show, nobody knows who this weirdo in a guayabera and a hat is, and everybody knows who Ed Reed is.
Right.
And that's the thing is, we want to engage these new people, but we've got to push ourselves to think as if we'd never been here before.
Absolutely. Totally agree. Just to paint another example of what you just said. So I was leaving the trade show last year, and I was in this huge long line at McCarran Airport, waiting to check my bag. And you know who was in that same line which would have been unheard of a day earlier, surrounded by all these retailers and fans and everything, who would have, done it for him easily, was Jonathan Drew. But Jonathan Drew and his father were waiting in the same line that I was, same amount of time. And from what I could tell, I wasn't trying to eavesdrop or anything. What I could tell was actually having some difficulty getting some bags checked with American Airlines or whatever. So when they leave the safety net of this industry, in a lot of ways, they're no different than you or I. And that's to us, that's unfathomable, because it's Jonathan Drew, it's Carlito Fuente, and these are the folks that we have put, again, not to be too obnoxious about it, but have put on the pedestal and have earned that spot on the pedestal and what they've done for this industry. But outside of the friendly confines of the industry, and even sometimes to the example that you pointed out about the gentleman at Pro Cigar, even inside, who are they? Yep. And that's a tragedy in itself. And that is one of the many gaps that I'm talking about in my concern and the quest to connect all the dots from A to B, B to C, all the way to the end result of which is to have this industry flourish.
Well, I mean, it's I didn't bring the story up as a tragedy. I think it's a success story. I think it's a story of a guy who had never been a part of it, and then showed up not because he was going to get in line for cigars, but because he wanted to go to the Dominican Republic and see all these things he'd never seen before. And he was so sucked into this guy's story that he had to learn who he was. That's how that's supposed to work, right? Because it wasn't just some guy like giving a regular tour. It was this guy who was so passionate about it. This guy had to lean over to somebody who looked like he knew what was going on and say, like, hey, who is this guy? Like, I want to know more about him. Who is this? And I don't know that you achieve that in every format. It's not just about being in the same room and across the table for 2 minutes. It's about really getting kind of sucked in. And that takes time. It can't just be, one blowout event. That's not to say there's not a place for an event like this. I think it's just, you got to figure out like what the purpose is for the event and whether doing the event that way at that time is the best way to achieve that purpose. If it's a money grab, which is a legitimate purpose, there's nothing wrong with money grab. Is a nasty way of putting it. If it's a way to raise, it has a
negative connotation, but
if it's a way to raise money for the legislative effort, okay, cool. I hope it works. If it's a way to collect business intelligence. It seems to me like you want to give yourself some more time to process that intelligence before somebody goes and uses it, like in any other industry.
Correct.
And if it's a way to bring in new people and grow the cigar community, I think it's got to be more fun than a convention center.
100% agree. So over the next few months, we have a lot of questions, and over the next few months, I'm sure we'll have more and more, but a lot of these questions will be answered as we get closer to Cigar Con 2020.
By the way, I'm sorry. I'm going to throw in here before we leave the issue of PCA. On a personal note, my biggest problem with PCA is that I want for this organization to really push back against the tyrannical labor unions in Las Vegas who are making it more and more difficult for me to get my Cuban coffee fix from the Espinosa booth. This is a real problem for me. I want to be able to get Cuban coffee all over the place, and these tyrants at the convention center have made it next to impossible. I will boycott this thing myself if I can't get a Cuban colada from any booth in the show.
It's an absolute necessity. We're exhausted. We need energy. We need caffeine. That is not a small. That is a small ask, and that is not a minute point.
Eric Jr.'s coffee is too good for them to just keep it to themselves. I need for them to be able to spread it around.
100%.
All of us worrying about whether the nannies from the convention center staff are going to fine people for giving away coffee. So
yes, 100%. That is a huge. That is a point not often brought up enough. And while that sounds sarcastic, and it sort of is, it's also 100%. It's 100% true.
It's really not. I will tell you, it is so not sarcastic that I did on multiple occasions spirit away Eric Jr. Cafecito from their booth to our booth. I have a lot of experience moving contraband. And I put it all to work at this last trade show.
Awesome. Well, Nick, I really appreciate your time sitting down tonight. We covered a lot of ground, some great work that you're doing at Cigar Snob Magazine and with your newest venture, DADE Magazine, and the PanCon podcast, as well as the Cigar Snob podcast. So I want to leave on this final note, a little bit of a fun question. I call it my curveball segment. It's more like a softball because it's just a question that I like to ask that I change it up every week, obviously, depending on my guest. But it's an easy one, a fun one. No doubt, free time is not something that comes easy to you or very often. But I have to ask, as a person who has started many projects in the last few years, and you've been really successful at really doing some amazing work in the arenas that you happen to be participating in, I do want to ask one more question. So you have two outlets in terms of the podcast world, Cigar Snob and PanCon. So if Nick Jimenez were to discover an elusive few extra hours in the cosmos other than the 24 hours that exist in the day, if you were able to create another podcast, what would the subject matter be of the third podcast, hosted, produced, or founded by Nick Jimenez?
Well, this is a fortuitous opportunity for a very premature plug, but there is a third one.
Oh my goodness!
And
not planned, everyone. Not planned.
Assuming that all goes well, assuming that all goes as planned, it will also live under the DADE umbrella. So it'll be sort of an expansion of the DADE family of podcasts. By the way, I've neglected the podcast, but there is something called the DADE podcast, which is hosted by me. And it's all long form interviews, and it's sort of all over the place topically. But if you search for the DADE podcast, you can find those, and there's some good long form stuff that I think is as interesting now as it was when I recorded each of them. So
correction to the question, fourth podcast then.
Sure, yeah. And actually, there's another one called Tea Time with Mike and Mike. Tea Time with Mike and Mike is how I met Mike Beltran, who I know is still watching. So Tea Time with Mike and Mike is Mike Beltran and Mike Ortiz, who owns a company called JoJo Tea. And Mike Ortiz, incidentally, is also a graduate of he's in the same alumni association that I mentioned, George and the Garcias are super into now. So I'm seeing Mike over here chiming in with it's whatever, dog. So tea time is also generally food and beverage industry people drinking tea and talking about all kinds of stuff from food and beverage to college football and what have you. So the new podcast that is not out yet and that we are working on making a thing, I won't say who it's hosted by because it may end up not happening, and I don't want to put them on the spot. But the idea is this is a guy who is from, Frank Cannon. It's DADE, like Dade County, DADE. So you can find us at dademag.com. So this new podcast, the idea is that each episode will be a discussion with a person who created a thing, and we're treating this very broadly, right? It could be a cigar brand, could be they developed a cocktail recipe, could be they created a TV show, could be they invented some household appliance, whatever it may be. And the idea is that the conversations will be about all of the things in the world that influenced the finished product, right?
Oh, wow.
So maybe it's like, oh, I wrote this incredible song. The conversation will be about maybe like, oh, I wrote it, it has influences of like, I don't know, the Beatles' Hey Jude. And I also, remember sitting in traffic and hearing cars honking, and I incorporated some of those ideas. Or I invented the rocket that will take us to that will take us to Mars. And I remember I was playing a director's set, and that was, so the idea is to sort of take those precursor ideas and make that the focus. Like, what are the things that inspired this other thing? It's a very loosey-goosey idea, but I think that
sounds fascinating, though. It's gonna be real cool people.
Loose enough. Yeah, I think it's loose enough. Like, if you enjoy, I think if you enjoy How I Built This, which is a podcast that I love, and it's also an NPR show, I believe. I think you'll be into this, and because How I Built This kind of takes all kinds of different angles. Have you ever heard How I Built This?
No, of course, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, so I think if you're into that, you'll be into this.
Oh, yes.
Because those stories, kind of sometimes they're very straight, like business, an investment. Like, I've met with this many VCs, and other times it's kind of about a very different sort of unconventional path, and that's where I want to go. Is I really like the stories behind these sort of finished products that we all see as very influential. And I think it'll be really cool to explore the influences and the inputs that produce those.
Well, hopefully that comes to fruition, Nick. That is really interesting, really exciting. I know that I will definitely tune into that, and I appreciate all of your time tonight, especially since I just mentioned how you don't have the time. But I appreciate you suffering through an interview without a cigar, because that's must have been really difficult, especially as I was smoking across from you. So
I put a big dent in this bottle of Peat Monster Scotch over here. So I joined you in some way. You were I drank for you and you smoked for me.
Perfect. I like it. Team effort all around. Really. So Nick, thank you again so much for being with us tonight. Thank you to all of our listeners and viewers who tuned in tonight as well. If you missed this, you can obviously catch the replay on our Facebook page, YouTube as well. And going forward, we will be doing this Facebook Live every Sunday at 9:30 p.m. Central. And if you catch us later, you can always download the podcast wherever you listen to podcasts, whether that's Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Podbean, Spotify, TuneIn, and more. And you are listening to us via those airwaves, via our sponsor, Connotation Premium Cigars. So for Nick Jimenez of Cigar Snob Magazine and DADE Magazine, really appreciate you. As always, again, subscribe, download, review. I'm Bear Duplessis. This has been ELOSOFUMARTAKES. This was our 83rd take. Guess what? We'll be back next week, and it'll be fantastic. Check out our page for upcoming guests. It'll be awesome, and we appreciate you. You have a wonderful night. Bid you adieu. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.